Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the reality of the resurrection in our continuing study of apologetics. If we compare what are called the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, Luke, we're going to leave John aside for the time being. Beginning the last chapter of each of those gospel accounts, we have the story of the resurrection. Notice Matthew 28:1 starts off now after the Sabbath, as it began to dawn toward the first day of the week. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary came to look at the grave. Notice Mark 16:1, when the Sabbath was over. Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James, a little bit more detail as to who the other Mary was, and another person named Salome brought spices so they might come and anoint him. Luke 24:1, but on the first day of the week at early dawn, the day refers to the they refers to the women that are mentioned in the previous chapter. They're not named again. Came to the tomb bringing the spices which they had prepared. We go on in Matthew's account. Notice a severe earthquake had occurred, for an angel of the Lord descended from heaven and came and rolled away the stone and sat upon it. Um, Notice as we look at Mark's account, we had to skip down a couple verses to see the section of it. Looking up, they saw the stone had been rolled away. It doesn't say who had rolled it, although it was extremely large. Mark is giving you, here's what they saw. I'm not really trying to explain it. You're just hearing it from, from those who heard and from those who heard what they heard. Luke's account, and they found the stone rolled away, really follows the same sort of idea that Mark does from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of Jesus. In Matthew's account, it seems to focus, remember, it talked about the angel coming down. His appearance was like lightning and his clothing as white as snow. Then it mentions not what the women see, but what the guards see. The guards shook for fear because of him and became like dead men. The guards aren't mentioned in Mark and Luke. Mark's account, entering the tomb, they saw a young man sitting at the right wearing a white robe, and they were amazed. Whereas Luke mentions not a young man, but two men. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men suddenly stood near them in dazzling clothing. So you notice there's white or dazzling clothing. So we have three different accounts, quite a bit different. Finishing up Matthew chapter 28, notice the angel says, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who has been crucified. He's not here, for he has risen, just as he said." Um, you hear words similar in Mark and Luke. In Mark, "Do not be amazed. You're looking for Jesus the Nazarene who's been crucified. He's risen. He's not here." So there's a report. And then Luke 24, verses 5 and 6, "Why do you seek the living one among the dead? He's not here, but he has risen." And so far, notice at the beginning of each of those accounts, you don't actually see Jesus. What you see is this angelic presence. Now you say, well, was it one or was it two? Well, first of all, if there's two, then there's at least one there. So what we have is three different accounts, and those telling the story didn't get together and say, let's say it this way. They actually said it quite differently, and that's actually a measure of its accuracy. You see, I've had some experience. Back in my old firefighter days, I was a battalion chief with the fire department. And I remember getting reports from firefighters who had been on emergency scenes, and sometimes the reports wouldn't match up. And I remember one time there'd been a big explosion, and two officers had been the first on the scene, each in their own apparatus, each in their own truck. And they pulled up, and reading the reports, I thought, did they even go to the same scene? What is this about? And I sat them down side by side and went through the reports, and they were very accurate, but they were telling the story from different perspectives, the same story, and they fit together perfectly, but you couldn't tell that just from reading the accounts without talking to them as well and sort of getting some additional insight. Now, we can't sit down separately with Matthew, Mark, or Luke, but what we do is we have their stories, and they do fit together. But they wrote them independently, at least these portions. Now, there's places where Matthew, Mark, and Luke are very close, where it sounds like one's copying off of the other almost. But when it comes to the resurrection story, that's not the case. They take different ways of describing it. Now they still fit together. It's still the same story, But there are different aspects that are presented, and while not contradictory, you can tell these are independent arrangements, independent tellings of the same story. Now we're going to switch over to John, which is very different. As we already said, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are telling the same story but differently. And then Mark is John, and this is the case with a lot of John's gospel, where I said that Matthew, Mark, and Luke in places they are very similar, not in the resurrection, but in other places. In John, that's not even the case. John tells lots of different miracles that aren't mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, different stories. All four tell of the resurrection, but notice how John starts off, chapter 20, verse 1. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came. Now, Mary had been mentioned in the previous, but she's the only one mentioned here. It doesn't say Mary and the other woman, which we know from the other counts that was there, but the camera is on her alone. And so Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb while it was still dark and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. So she ran and came to Simon Peter. Now, this part isn't mentioned well, it is mentioned if we'd read a little further, but there's more focus on what takes place here. She ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. John he's been talking all through his gospel account of another disciple whom Jesus loved, and everybody wants to say, well, who's the other disciple? And John's not telling us. I have a sneaking suspicion of why he's not telling us, but I'm not going to mention that now. And so I'm not going to either. I'm just going to call him the other disciple. And he said to them, they have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him. Notice her assumption immediately is that the body has been taken away by someone else. So she does not assume there's a resurrection. Empty tomb in her mind does not immediately equate to a resurrection. And that tells us that she and presumably others were not expecting a resurrection. They didn't immediately jump to the conclusion, oh, Jesus must have risen from the dead. They did not assume that because that was not in their expectation. And so, verse 3, Peter and the other disciple went forth, and they were going to the tomb. The two were running together. They were going rather rapidly. And the other disciple ran ahead faster than Peter and came to the tomb first, and stooping and looking in. And I've been to a number of ancient tombs, and as I'm thinking about that, most of the ones that I've been to, you actually had to sort of get down. It was usually below grade, or maybe it's become below grade because sometimes the grade builds up after the fact. But oftentimes it was below grade, and you'd actually have to get down. I remember one that I went into. This was in Anatolia, modern day Turkey. And my wife said, "What are you going in there? You're going to get in, there could be all sorts of things." I said, "You stay here, I'll be fine." Um, and had to get down on my belly. Now I don't think this was quite that low, to crawl in. Well, notice he comes to the tomb and stooping and looking in, he saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he did not go in. He's not sure that he wants to, go into a tomb. There's something dead that's supposed to have been there. Verse 6, and so Simon Peter also came following him and entered the tomb. He seems to have gone right in, and he saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. So now, how orderly was it all? I don't know about that, but notice the details that are given in John's gospel as far as what the wrappings and how they were laid out and so on. Verse 8, so the other disciple who had first come to the tomb then also entered. He eventually comes in as well. He sees that nothing bad happens to Peter. He's not coughing or nothing in his lungs that he could see. And he saw and believed. Now, what did he believe? I would say he believed the report that Mary Magdalene had given that the body's not there. And that's explained in verse 9. For as yet they did not understand the scripture that he must rise again from the dead. Remember how we looked in a previous episode, we were talking about the various prophecies of the Messiah, and one of them was that there would be a resurrection. But that wasn't all that clear, and they hadn't put that together. And so they were not expecting either, just like Mary Magdalene was not expecting a resurrection, they were not expecting a resurrection either. And so the disciples, both of them, went away again to their own homes, or to wherever they were staying, their place of habitation. Verse 11, notice that even though they leave, the camera doesn't follow them. Instead, it comes back on Mary, but Mary was standing outside the tomb weeping, and so as she wept, she stooped and looked into the tomb, and she saw two angels. Now, these are the angels mentioned earlier in the other gospel accounts, and yet the movement of the disciples, that was glossed over. So again, we have very different accounts of the same story. We can piece them together and put them together. Sometimes that's a little bit difficult to do. But notice she saw two angels in white, one at the head, one at the feet. Again, details that were not given in the previous episodes, where the body of Jesus had been lying. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they've laid him." I'm not sure if she really got that these were angels. I don't think they necessarily had wings or white, yes, but maybe not necessarily glowing. Um, I'm not sure she put it together, even here. Otherwise, you wouldn't just be, sort of nonchalantly speaking. Um, so these angelic messengers are speaking to her, and I'm not sure, we're not told what she was thinking as she saw this. When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. And so here she sees Jesus, does not recognize him as such. Again, there is a lack of expectation, and I'm not sure, I've had the experience. I remember one time my wife was driving into the seaport where my fire station was located, is back in my firefighter years. Um, and I was out on there was some sort of minor incident, and I was out there and sort of watching the traffic, and she drove by, not expecting to see me there. She was expecting she had actually taken a wrong turn. I was turned around a bit, and she drove past me, and I said, "Hold it up there!" And she sort of squeaked and looked up at me, and looked at me and didn't recognize me. She saw the uniform, didn't recognize me because she wasn't expecting to see me there. And I said, "Paula," and all of a sudden her eyes were open. The same sort of thing happens here. Now, there are other places, and we're going to look at one of those in a minute, in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus appeared and was not immediately recognized by his disciples. But there we're told because their eyes were shut. I'm thinking sort of a supernatural thing. I'm not sure that that's the case here. She just wasn't expecting him. Maybe she sees somebody standing nearby, but doesn't really look him in the face. Verse 15, Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" And supposing him to be the gardener, she had this idea in mind. She said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." She's offering to move the body, which she thinks has been moved. Maybe it had been placed in a tomb that was a new tomb and didn't really belong there. Verse 16, Jesus said to her, "Mary," and she turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," and that is my rabbi, my teacher. Jesus said to her, "Stop clinging to me." um, the Greek there is the present tense, so it's like that has that continuing. I think the old King James said, "Don't touch me," but it was "Don't keep touching me." It's present tense, and so they've correctly translated it here. "Stop clinging to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father." But go to my brethren and say to them, "I ascend to my Father and to your Father, and my God and your God." And so she is instructed to pass the word on, and she does that. Now, verse 18, Mary Magdalene came, announcing to the disciples, "I've seen the Lord," and that he had said these things to her. Meanwhile, later that day, and I'm switching over to back to Luke's account just to tell the story, because John continues to talk about what happened later that day. But on Luke's account, we have the story of two disciples. Only one is going to be mentioned by name. They're on their way to Emmaus. One is named Cleopas. We see this in Luke 24:18. The other one goes unnamed. And as they are walking, they see Jesus and they don't immediately recognize him. And we're told because their eyes had been shut, sort of, and it's not that they couldn't see the road or the sun, but they look at him and it just doesn't connect. Um, and this seems to have been something happening that was supernatural, but they don't recognize Jesus. And they begin having a conversation with this person they've met on the road, and they've been talking about Jesus. They've heard the story of Mary. They've heard about Peter and the other disciple, and they're talking about it. And Jesus comes up and says, What are you talking about?" And they say, "Oh, we're talking about Jesus and his death and this report that his body was moved." And he says, "Well, who's Jesus?" "What do you mean, who's Jesus? Are you the only one around who hasn't heard about this?" And they enter it, they're telling Jesus about Jesus, not recognizing that it's Jesus who's the one that they're telling. And as they finally get to their destination, they stop, they invite him to join them, and they sit down to eat, and he breaks bread and blesses it. And all of a sudden they realize who it is that they're looking at. Um, and suddenly he's gone. And so here was a resurrection appearance. Now these almost sound sort of mystical, like was this a vision? Was this a dream? Was this, what was this that had taken place? But those aren't the only appearances. Going back to John, we left off at John for a moment. Verse 19. So when it was evening on that day, then more day, it was still the first day of the week. When the doors were shut where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, they weren't afraid of Jesus. They were Jesus. After all, had been arrested and crucified, and they're thinking they could be next. All of a sudden, Jesus came and stood in their midst and said to them, "Peace be with you." And when he had said this, he showed them both his hands and his feet and his side. He still had the marks, the crucifixion marks. On his side, remember, a soldier had taken a spear and thrust it up under his side. Apparently, there was still I don't think it was bleeding anymore. It was healed, but you could still see where it had taken place. So Jesus said to them again, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I also send you." And when he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, "Receive the Holy Spirit." Now, they don't receive it yet. That's not going to happen till later on. But then he gives a promise: if you forgive the sins of any, their sins have been forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they have been retained. But Thomas, one of the 12, called Didymus, the term Didymus actually means twin. Makes me wonder, was Thomas a twin, and was he twinned with one of the other disciples, or was somebody else? We're not told that. But he wasn't there, was not with them when Jesus came. Verse 25, so the other disciples were saying to him, apparently he comes back into the area. He'd been away. I don't know what he was doing. But they said, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the imprint of the nails, and put my finger into the place of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." I want evidence. Maybe you had, and I don't know what he was thinking. Maybe you guys had a vision, a mass hallucination. I want the experience of evidence. Thomas, he's known sometimes as Doubting Thomas. I'd like to call him Skeptical Thomas. In fact, that's my middle name. Um, and and I get his skepticism. I think I might have said the same thing if I was there. Well, verse 26, after 8 days, his disciples were again inside, and Thomas with them. Jesus came, the doors having been shut, and stood in their midst, and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Reach here with your finger, see my hands, and reach here with your hand, and put it into my side. And do not be unbelieving, but believing." And Thomas gives the statement of faith. Thomas answered and said to him, "My Lord and my God." And I don't think he was taking God's name, the Lord's name, in vain. I think he was addressing Jesus, referring to Jesus as my Lord and my God. So here's the testimony of a skeptic, one who said, "Look, I've heard your report. I've heard this idea that Jesus has risen, and instead of just assuming that's going to be true, instead of just this blind leap of faith, I want to see evidence. I'm skeptical." And here we have the testimony of a skeptic, one who had refused to believe when he heard the report, and now was confronted by it, and he gives his statement of faith. And just to finish up the passage, Jesus said to him, "Because you have seen me, have you believed? Blessed are they who did not see and yet believe." And let me just say, that's you and me and all of us today who believe. We haven't seen Jesus. I personally have not seen Jesus, and yet I have come to believe. And so there's a blessing for those of us who did not see and yet have believed. Now, one last passage, and then we're going to talk about all of these. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. This is the Apostle Paul, and he's writing to the people at Corinth, the church at Corinth, because there's a issue. You see, secular Greeks did not believe in a resurrection. Some Jews did not believe in the idea of resurrection, but the idea of a resurrection was actually contrary to Greek philosophy. And so that contrary belief has been affecting people. It's been challenging their faith. And so he writes to them, 1 Corinthians 15, beginning verse 3, "For I delivered to you as of first importance, what I also received." And so he's doing what we do, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day according to the scriptures, and that he appeared. Notice, the truth of the gospel is that Christ died, that he was buried, that he was raised, but specifically here, that he appeared to Cephas. Now, Cephas is the Aramaic word for rock, just like Peter, or they would say Petros, is the Greek word for rock. It's the nickname of Simon, who we call Peter. But you notice it works in both Aramaic as well as in Greek. Um, that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 brethren at one time. Now, the Gospels do not record that appearance. When did Jesus appear to more than 500 at one time? We don't know. We're not given that. Paul tells us that story, and that tells me something we already have noted, that the gospel accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, tell stories of what took place, stories of the resurrection, but they don't all tell the same story. None of them tells everything. We have to put it together a little bit like a crossword puzzle. Again, that is the mark of authenticity, is the fact that they don't try to collaborate and put their stories all together. And Paul doesn't either. Here he makes mention of an appearance that involved more than 500 brethren at one time, most of whom remain until now, but some have fallen asleep. Now, doesn't mean they were getting sleepy. That's a euphemism to describe somebody who has died. So that most of those who had seen Jesus were still alive, but there were some that had now died in the intervening years. Um, Notice, and then he appeared to James. Now that's also not mentioned in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. Uh, this James, I think, is the half brother of Jesus, who, by the way, the brothers of Jesus had initially not believed in him. They had heard this preaching. Their own brother turned into a preaching traveling rabbi, and they thought, wait a minute, he's just supposed to be he's just our older brother. Yes, he's good. Yes, he was really upright and all, but they had not thought of him in terms of being a Messiah until the resurrection. He appeared to James and then to all the apostles. And then Paul goes on, we're not going to go into this part, verse 8, last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared to me also. Paul himself had an encounter with the resurrected Jesus, but not before his ascension, but at a later date. We're not going to get into that now. But Paul is listing some of the times where Jesus has appeared to people. And he's saying, look, there's more than 500 who saw him, and most of them are still alive. If you don't believe, go check with them. Go ask them. And mention some, like the apostles and like James, who saw him. Now, there have been some naturalistic theories that have been put forth as to try to explain what took place with the presupposition of these theories. All presuppose there's no such thing as miracles, so there must be some other explanation. One of those is the legend theory, that the idea of a resurrection was just a story that got told and retold and facilitated, and it developed into legend, sort of like George Washington chopping down the cherry tree, which was something, a story that was invented 100 years after George Washington had lived. Is the story of Jesus like that? And the answer is no. First of all, because They were saying immediately. This wasn't something that came out many, decades or 100 years later. Immediately, the early followers of Jesus who had not expected a resurrection suddenly were saying, "We saw him. We saw him rise from the dead." And names are given, and actually dates. They didn't remember. They didn't say 2022, things like that. They would give whose reign it was at the time, and that sort of biographical and historical information is given. This doesn't fit the the genre of a legend. The second theory says, well, the body was just moved. And that was actually the theory that some of the people had had when it was first reported. So you can see why this would be a good theory. That was their theory. Mary Magdalene thought, well, somebody came and moved the body. But then, first of all, that's not going to be the case because people actually subsequently saw him. That doesn't work if the body was merely moved. And also, if the body was merely moved, you say, well, who moved the body? Who had reason to move it? And then once the story started getting out of Jesus rising from the dead, especially with the Roman soldiers, remember, if the body was moved, if they just went to the wrong tomb, and the way the theory goes, sometimes it was early light and the sun hadn't come yet, and so in the dark, that Mary Magdalene just simply went to the wrong tomb. But remember, that means that also Peter and John went to the wrong tomb. And it means that the soldiers were guarding the wrong tomb. And it means that all the Jewish authorities ever had to do was go to the right tomb, produce the body, and this whole Christian mess that began to spring up immediately would have gone away. And so that theory just does not hold water. Thirdly, the swoon theory. This is a theory um, that says that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, that he was crucified, yes, but he was taken off the cross and then didn't die. And then in the coolness of the tomb, they had wrapped him and that sort of bound his wounds. And he made his way out of the tomb a couple of days later and was seen by his disciples, and they thought he had risen from the dead when he hadn't really risen from the dead. He had just not died, and they saw him, and he was okay. Now, there's some serious problems with that theory. First of all, we're told that the Roman soldiers who were professional soldiers, remember, their profession in life was to make sure that live people were dead. That's what they did for a living, to take living people and make them not living. And they had checked in the case of Jesus to make sure that he wasn't living anymore. They had taken a spear and thrust it up under his ribs. And if you're down below somebody and you thrust something up under their ribs, that's going to pierce their lungs and their heart, and you're not going to survive that. And they had done that to make sure he was dead. And then, almost contrary to what anybody would expect, but just because some people said, well, we heard Jesus talk about a resurrection. The disciples weren't expecting it, but the Jewish authorities thought, just to make sure, they had had a guard place at the tomb to make sure that the body wasn't taken. Again, this goes back to that body being moved idea. So there had been a guard place, and they had been there to make sure the body wasn't taken. They wouldn't have been fooled by somebody, half dead, just sort of stumbling out of the tomb. No, they would have um, probably taken him, arrested him, and maybe made sure he was dead. But when Jesus appeared, it's not somebody in a weakened condition who's, just fallen apart no, he appears in all victory. Remember how he walked 7 miles with two of the disciples to Emmaus, and then later on, suddenly shows up back in Jerusalem. That's, can I call that? That's almost supernatural. Well, I think Jesus was supernatural. So the swoon theory does not connect. And then we mentioned in passing sort of the mistaken tomb theory, that perhaps the woman just went to the wrong tomb. But remember, the soldiers were guarding the tomb. And that means anybody would, and there's a number of trips that people make to the tomb looking, um, and all they had to do was go to the right tomb, and that would have been the end of the story. And that doesn't account for having seen the risen Jesus. So the naturalistic theories just do not hold water. The vision theory. Now it's interesting because in one of the accounts, Jesus shows up to his disciples and he says, "Get me some fish." And they bring him food, and he eats it, as if to show, "Look, I'm not just some sort of vision or spirit. Watch the fish go down." And he eats with them, and he says to Thomas, "Here, touch me. Here's my hands. Here's my side." That's not the language of a vision. Or thank God Jesus with Mary Magdalene. Okay, you can stop holding to me now. You can stop clinging to me. That's not the language of a vision. It was not a vision. It wasn't the wrong tomb. It wasn't a weak and not quite dead Messiah. It was one who rose from the dead. Let's look at several evidences for the resurrection. First of all, we mentioned the empty tomb. And like we said before, all anybody had to do to disprove the resurrection was go to the tomb where the body was and find the body, bring it out, and that would have been the end of the story. But even those who were not expecting the resurrection, no, I'm going to say it stronger than that. And in the case of Thomas, those who were skeptical of the resurrection they became convinced once they saw Jesus. The empty tomb, the appearances of Jesus to various peoples at various times. You see, it wasn't just like a one experience hallucination to one person. No, it was a number of people. Sometimes one, sometimes two, sometimes 12, or actually 11, sometimes 500 different appearances of Jesus at different times and places were part of that evidence. The transformation of the disciples. You see, there have been some who have suggested, well, this was just a story invented by the disciples to sort of pass on the teachings of Jesus. They weren't expecting a resurrection. They were actually fearful by their own account. And what's more is after the death, burial, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus, you see them a month or two later standing in Jerusalem, completely changed as to their outlook. Instead of running and hiding, they are with boldness proclaiming one major truth, that they saw a dead man get up and walk. And they begin to be persecuted, beaten for it. Eventually, most of the apostles, according to both the biblical account and church tradition, almost all the apostles were eventually killed for their faith. And all they ever had to do to stop the beatings, to stop the imprisonment, to stop the death penalty, all they had to ever do was say, yeah, we just made it up. He was really alive. Or he was really dead. Uh, all they had to do was to deny the resurrection. And it would have all stopped. They weren't making money out of this. They had no reason to lie. And yet they were changed by this. Even those who had been skeptical, even those who had previously not believed, they were changed. And of course, this has led to the existence of the church, something that has lasted. But you remember, the church started immediately. And it started immediately because those that were in the immediacy had seen the resurrected Jesus. And yet that truth has gone on to be believed. It didn't go away. And to this day, 2,000 years later, it still has not gone away because Jesus is still in the life-changing business. And he can change your life as well.